Uh, Welcome, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us today. I'm very pleased to uh, open this seminar of the Beyond Extraction, Memory, and Revolt seminar series. My name is Dr. Jamila Ghaddar, and you are coming into my archival activism graduate class at the University of Amsterdam. You can see some of the students behind me, and we're very pleased to welcome archivists and scholars and historians and community members into our classroom and for us to be in conversation. Um, we've had a great run of seminars, absolutely. Uh, but I would say today is a very special day for me. I'm very honored to be hosting Dr. Francis Garaba, who I've been trying to get for a little bit of a while, ever since I met Dr. Garaba at an excellent conference that took place at the University of Ghana. I'll speak about that a little bit more in a minute. But first, I'm going to hand it over to my partner in crime, Krystal Payne, to talk a little bit more about the seminar series. Over to you, Krystal.
Hi, everyone. We're so happy that you're here with us today for Beyond Extraction, Memory, and Revolt, the seminar series, today spotlighting the incredible work of Dr. Francis Garaba. Beyond Extraction, Memory, and Revolt is a free virtual seminar series co-hosted by the Archival and Digital Media Lab and Nassauia Arab Media History, and it's convened within the broader framework of the Pedagogy for Archival Liberation project. This series is committed to confronting and dismantling the colonial and white supremacist logics that continue to structure archives, media infrastructure, and heritage institutions. Moving beyond extraction as both method and metaphor, the series insists that memory is not a resource to be mined, cataloged, or commodified, but instead a living terrain of struggle. The Pedagogy for Archival Liberation project, led by Dr. Jamila Ghaddar, Dr. Mariam Karim, Rose Mianga, and myself, advances South-South and South-North exchanges that reject extractive knowledge economies and instead cultivate solidarities grounded in accountability, reciprocity, and return. Housed at ADML, the Archives and Digital Media Lab, it works to build transnational networks dedicated to reclaiming archives, knowledge systems, heritage, narrative authority, history, and land from empire and white supremacy. We will be putting links to this work in the meeting chat as we go. To move beyond extraction is to refuse the colonial impulse to take without accountability, to extract stories, images, labor, land, and life while erasing the conditions of their seizure. Through Memory and Revolt, we gather not simply to critique these regimes, but to strategize against them, to build collective power and advance liberatory praxis within and against the institutions that shape historical memory, media narratives, and knowledge production. Um, as Dr. Ghaddar said, the seminars are embedded within her courses at the University of Amsterdam. And bridging scholarship and struggle, theory and practice, the series brings community into the classroom and the classroom into community, inviting participants to reimagine archival and heritage futures beyond colonial containment and towards reparative possibility. We have one seminar left in the series, and we encourage you to register if you've not had the chance to do so. We'll make sure you have information about that.
Thank you
Back
very much,
to you.
Krystal. And to return to the topic of today, we are talking about what gets called migrated or displaced or stolen archives from the period of political decolonization in the Third World, the Afro-Asian liberation struggles, and so on in the last century, where as the colonizers were leaving, they took with them destroyed or otherwise made inaccessible large amounts, or the majority, the vast majority of the archives that had been in the colonies, creating many challenges and contestations and problems from the beginning beginning of the Archives and Digital Media Lab, we have prioritized creating these kinds of South-South and North-South conversations as an attempt to promote and further amplify the efforts to reassert this on the agenda of the global community and the archival science world, and also as part of trying to think through together the various cases, there are hundreds, but to also think through the impasse of what is to be done. How can these records be repatriated, returned? How can this contest over history, information, knowledge, and identity be resolved in the interest of justice and liberation? With that, I find that Dr. Garaba's work is very key in moving us past this impasse and also bringing different geographies and communities and domains into the conversation. You can find Dr. Garaba's full bio in the chat as well as in our website. But in the interest of time, I'm going to hand it over right to him. Again, welcome, Dr. Garaba. It's truly an honor. I'm very pleased to welcome you to take over the virtual floor. Please go ahead. Are you there, Dr. Garaba? The proverbial technical difficulties, everybody, bear with us. Okay, I think perhaps Dr. Garaba is rejoining. And this after we did all the proper tech checks, everyone, but of course, one of the challenges, goodness knows I know this all the time from Lebanon where we lose electricity and internet, but I'm not sure in this case. So maybe what I'll do is I'll take this occasion to read Dr. Garaba's bio for us while he rejoins. Dr. Francis Garaba has worked for the National Archives of Zimbabwe as an archivist and as a manuscript librarian at the Lutheran Theological Institute Library in South Africa. He has also worked at the Midland State University in Zimbabwe and as a lecturer in archival studies at the University of Fort Hare and an honorary lecturer with the School of Religion, Philosophy, and Classics at the University of KwaZulu-Natal. Very busy man, of course. Presently, he is with UKZN as an associate professor in records and archives management. His research interests include records and archives management in national archival liberation movements, churches, schools, universities, and sports associations. He is a National Research Foundation C-rated researcher with a growing publication record and has presented conference papers at flagship conferences in the records and archives discipline. And here he is, Dr. Garaba. Yes, we can see he's joining. Thank you everyone for your patience. Welcome, Dr. Garaba. Can you hear me? Hello, Dr. Garaba. Ah, we seem to have lost him again.
I think there might be some audio issues.
Hmm.
I heard a little moan.
Yeah. Hmm. Yeah. Dr. Garaba, can you hear us? Can you type in the chat?
Dr. Jamila,
Oh.
can you hear me?
Oh, there you are. Oh my goodness. Yes? Can you speak again? Hello?
Hello, can you hear me, Dr.
I can
Ghaddar?
hear you. Yes.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, the internet is not stable this side, so it's impacting.
Usually, if you don't have archives, you don't have electricity either. I understand, of course, and everyone understands, and obviously should be patient
It's
as
not
we. Ah, there you are. Wonderful. Okay, shall I leave it to you then, Dr. Garaba, to go ahead?
Yes, I missed the first part of the intros, but anyway,
We were
I'll
just
just go
saying
ahead.
wonderful things about you.
Thank you so much.
Please
Yes.
go ahead, Dr. Garaba, please.
Okay. So I'm not sure with the break in connectivity whether it's going to affect this lecture, but let's hope for the best. Let's hope for the best. Am I audible enough?
We can hear you very well.
Okay. Yes, okay. Greetings, class and participants, wherever you are, due to the different time zones. It could be morning, it could be afternoon, it could be evening. And thank you, Dr. Jamila, for inviting me for this lecture. It is a privileged honor to deliver this virtual lecture for Archives and Digital Media Lab. And thanks to the University of Amsterdam for granting me this opportunity to share with your graduate students my views on this contentious subject of migrated archives and archival activism. Let me begin first by giving you a chronology of my research journey on migrated archives so as to contextualize this lecture. This all started in 2010 as my PhD study was on liberation struggle archives, which is one category of migrated archives. I followed this up at the School of Social Sciences at the University of KwaZulu-Natal in 2019 when I was a respondent to the renowned archival activist and the University of Botswana academic, Professor Munjama. He presented a lecture on migrated archives, the African experience. And as a respondent, I went on to publish a paper on this topic in the Journal of the South African Society of Archivists in 2021, which was titled Migrated Archives, Time for Closure to Turn the Wheels of Reconciliation and Healing for Africa. In 2022, I was invited by the Institute of African Studies at the University of Ghana for an interdisciplinary workshop on epistemologies Decolonization and Displacement, where I met your instructor, Dr. Jamila Ghaddar, and she alluded to this earlier on. I provided a commentary on presented papers on colonial archives and migrated archives. With all this insight and knowledge, and coupled by my reading of scholarship on migrated archives, I embarked on research where I focused on Zimbabwe as a case study, as the country at one time was under colonial rule, and so it had its migrated archives taken abroad. This explains this lecture, which is a synopsis or tweaked version of the paper that was published in Atlantic in 2025. I have adjusted that paper so that it aligns with your graduate needs on archival activism. I've already provided the link in advance for participants to read the full paper so that we can meaningfully engage on this subject. This lecture will be structured as follows. I'll start by highlighting why archives matter as individuals and also in societies and also in organizations, and then unpack the concepts of archival activism and migrated archives, and also look into why I chose this topic and also why I chose this title, Two Peas in a Pod. And then also look at the issues of power, ownership, and control, and then focus on Zimbabwe as a case study. And then I also try to highlight the ethics and tension that usually crop up when one engages on these concepts of archival activism and migrated archives. And then also look at why this matters now. And then also the need for us to rethink the archive. And then I'll give you some food for thought, some teasers, so to say, for us to warm up for the discussion or conversation on this lecture. As you shall see, there is a plethora of divergent views, but that is what scholarship is all about. Right, so why do archives matter? Archives preserve first-hand evidence of what people, both individually and in groups, thought and did in the past. And evidence tells us not only who we are, but who we might be. So in a nutshell, according to one authority, archives, they actually inform future generations of the actions taken today. They provide evidence of our heritage and cultural identity. And this takes us to the issue of archival neutrality. Hilary Jenkinson epitomizes this quite well in 1937. He believed that an archivist's duty is the physical and moral defense of the archives. Archives are not neutral as they are shaped by human decisions at every stage. We are memory professionals, we are record-keeping stewards, we are evidence specialists, and this is where the power of archives comes in for good governance, for accountability and transparency, which also explains why archives matter. One has to look around and see the injustices that are affecting the world. Look, for instance, memory erasure of Palestine nationhood. And so, should an archivist be neutral, turn a blind eye? Should we fold down our arms when this is happening in front of us? And also, look around and see the assault on the record-keeping profession in the USA by President Trump and so on. Harris 22 in his book, Ghosts of the Archive, argues that the core of justice is the most important human imperative. And the work of archives is, in a word, justice. In that book, it posits archive as an essential resource for social justice activism. Van Harris, to put this on the record, is a prominent South African archivist who has made telling contributions in the field of records and archives. He is an archival activist because when South Africa attained independence in 1994, they made a clarion call on the records that were being destroyed by the apartheid government. As you shall see, archives, they follow the flag. When a government is outgoing, they always make sure they take all the records with them. So this brings us to the question as to why are archives sites of struggle today? This is because assembling in archives carries political connotations. It's a subjective process. So one has to interrogate as to why, how, when, and for whom these archives were created in the first place. Because the archives is highly politicized. And Derrida, 1996, for instance, mentioned that the reality is that there's no political power without control of the archive. So archives are not neutral spaces. They are sites of power where indigenous voices have often been marginalized or excluded. This leads us to archival activism. Your course manual correctly acknowledges that the definition of archival activism is ambiguous. And so we need to make reference to authoritative sources so that we can unpack this concept of archival activism. Two sources in mind here are one by law 2021 and the Society of American Archivists Dictionary of Archives Terminology. We need definitions so that we are on the same wavelength, so that we are on the same page. According to Williams 2014, definitions are aimed at describing the meaning of a term or word to assist one in comprehending concepts, their use and applicability. So within the archive of fraternity, we need these definitions so that we can communicate as one, and then also so that we can chart the way forward in terms of the profession itself. So Law 2021 refers to archival activism as actions taken by archival workers that acknowledge and engage with the political nature of archival work, with the goal of creating social change. And this action is also acknowledged by the Dictionary of Archive Terminology from the Society of American Archivists. As they note that an archivist who tries to document the underdocumented aspects of society and to support political and social causes through that work, or an archivist who seeks to move the archives profession, archives workplaces, and society in general towards social justice. In a nutshell, archival activism is all about advancing human rights through liberatory action. So both definitions, they apply to the issue of migrated archives and archival activism. And it all depends on where you stand in this debate. Do we embark on a collective drive because there's a gap in collections? We're talking about community-led or grassroots archives. Or do you advocate for a return of displaced archives? This is how the concept of counter archives and archivist interventions gains currency, as this arises out of a need to redress not only historical injustices, but for the underrepresented to be heard. So the decolonization discourse or narrative, it has to be understood in that context. As early as 1970, Howard Zinn was using the term activist archivist. And so the question you should be asking yourself as you are doing this module on archival activism is, when you leave the University of Amsterdam, will you be able to speak up for the cause of the record without fear or favor, like what your instructor, Dr. Jamila, is doing in highlighting memory erasure for the Palestinian and Lebanese cause in terms of their history and documentary heritage? Dr. Jamila is a global intellectual icon and warrior who represents the voice of the voiceless. She has stood up to the international community to raise awareness on the implications and gravity of memory erasure, which is the hallmark of both archival and intellectual activism. She has successfully established a network of intellectuals and practitioners through the organization of conferences and workshops aimed at raising awareness of Israel's genocidal war on Gaza and memory erasure. Such intellectual epistemicide needs to be flagged for the benefit of posterity. In this regard, she is an activist, archivist, and scholar, a term to add to archival vocabulary. From this experience and expertise, we should have that grounding as to what evidence protection means, as the information contained in archives is powerful, so that this remains sacrosanct. The old adage goes that charity begins at home. And so ask yourselves how you are managing your own family history and your individual history as this road maps your archival activism approach. How will you conscientize humanity so that they appreciate the value of archives and records? As this is what is missing in the archival profession. Archival activism should be ingrained in the DNA of archival practice. Laura Miller makes a clarion call for record keepers to educate digital natives so that they understand the value of evidence. Delivering a lecture in honor of the renowned Polish archivist Konarski, Miller in 2023 reiterated that one of the most important actions we in the archival community can take today is to engage with the public to raise awareness on the critical importance of evidence as a source of fact and truth. Such awareness is part of advocacy in the form of archival activism. So as archivists, we need to be advocates. The more we engage with the public about the value of archives, the more we gain their support, according to Miller, 2023. And she further adds that sometimes we need to be activists. In delivering this keynote lecture in honor of Konarski, Laura Miller borrowed heavily from her book and brilliantly remarked that we need to come together, all those who care for the record, the public and record keepers, and establish a movement, an evidence movement to be precise, because this rallying call is for us to protect the authenticity of evidence. So what do we mean by migrated archives? These are archives that have been removed from the context of their creation and where ownership is disputed. Laurie makes point in reference to this in 2019. In archival parlance, these are referred to as fugitive archival material, archival claims, and so on. And the bottom line here is that these archives are not supposed to be where they are. Sometimes they're referred to as estrays. So the lack of consensus on terminology points to the fact that there is an interplay between actors and those records, as those records are unique to particular cases as reflected in their histories. To understand this category of archives, one is to contextualize them in terms of how they were created in the first place. It could be either due to war, looting, dispersal, or maybe illegal trading. The underlying philosophy behind this genre of archives is their association with the history of empire. We talk of colonialism, we talk of imperialism, and then we talk of white supremacy. And Audrey Dipty's 23 work highlights that the term migrated archives is problematic. It's a problematic euphemism and is a careful chosen misnomer that masks the archival injustice. For this lecture, the focus is on archives that were taken from the country in which they were originally accumulated, from a colonial and post-colonial context. And so, why did I settle for this title? Two peas in a pod, archival activism and migrated archives. These two concepts are deeply intertwined, so there is a symbiotic relationship between the two. Archival activism challenges who controls memory, whose histories are preserved, and how access is granted. On the other hand, migrated archives, they talk about archives displaced by colonialism, war, digitization, exile, or institutional power. And they are often objects of that activism. So activists, you as an archival activist, you frequently intervene to reclaim the displaced records, to demand repatriation or shared custodianship, or to reinterpret the archives that were created through these oppressive systems. So two peas in a pod, it actually signifies mutual dependency. And this symbiotic relationship is further explained when one considers the dynamic nature of archives, as they are not static, but always in a state of flux to meet societal needs, changing priorities. And this is why we talk of reappraisal. This is why we talk of deaccessioning, and also ethical standards in terms of access, privacy, and so on. So the Society of American Archivists, Dictionary of Archives Terminology, it defines repatriation as the return of cultural materials, particularly archival records, to the country or people who created them. This takes us to the issue of power and ownership. Power is about bureaucratic control. We talk of collection drive from above and not from below. Talk of grassroots or community-driven archives. So Hilary Jenkinson's stance should be viewed from this perspective. Should we be passive recipients of archives and keep them for the depositor? We should not interrogate. Again, this needs to be viewed against the backdrop of the archivist-employer relationship when it comes to archival ethics. This collection from above, it raises deep-seated access issues as whose voice is in the archive. In the developing countries, access is in terms of use. You find that there's low use of archives simply because these archives, they do not speak to the community. One scholar, Wepe 2019, argues that in South Africa, the archival holdings, they largely reflect the colonial or apartheid period and the elite voices rather than the diversity of the nation. He also links migrated archives to the notions of archives without archives in marginalized communities. Meaning repositories, they do exist, but they hold very little of their own community's memory or voice because much of that has been displayed or it was never collected. So in such circumstances, users, they find it difficult to relate with the archives as they do not speak to them. When it comes to the issue of ownership, this is problematic. For our colonizers, the records they document imperial conquests, hence their reluctance to part with them. While for the colonized, this is historical, there is a historical gap in terms of understanding how colonialism happened and for social justice. And so the repatriation claims should be seen from this perspective. This dispute explains why migrated archives are at times referred to as disputed claims or archives. And because of this dispute, it has actually generated the concept of shared heritage in terms of ownership and control, which is also disputable. And this is where the issue of digitization comes in. But this raises authenticity issues, as how does one tell that the digitized records have not been redacted, they have not been tampered with, they have not been altered. It has been documented in the literature on migrated archives that there have been several cases or episodes where this has actually happened. One just has to look at the Foreign and Commonwealth Office records. And the scholar Banton has been quite vocal on this. And one asks, how can this be shared on a heritage that was stolen from us? Commenting on a parallel topic in the museum world on stolen artifacts, one scholar by the name Valley correctly posited that one cannot claim ownership on something that was stolen, as this is a shared history based on violence and theft. This takes us to the issue of archival description. The idea of archival description as power is actually central to understanding migrated archives. Because when archives move, control over meaning often moves with them. So when an archive is migrated from the global south to the global north, or from local custody to institutional platforms, the receiving institution's descriptive standards, they frequently override or marginalize original systems of meaning. So power actually shapes who gets to name, classify, and contextualize those records. So archival description actually shapes how migrated archives are known, how they are used, and how they are valued. So who describes them, and according to whose worldview, can either reinforce historical inequalities or challenge them. And this takes us to the case study in Southern Africa with reference to Zimbabwe. Zimbabwe was under British colonial rule until 1980, when it attained independence. When the previous government left office, they took records with them, and so they are scattered in Britain and South Africa. It's good, or it's fortunate that the Smith papers were returned in 2018. And this transition of governments actually lends credence to the fact that archives, they do follow the flag. And the records in question are ex-Rhodesian military files and cabinet files and so on in the UK. An opportunity presented itself towards the late 1980s and early 1990s when two archivists were sent to the United Kingdom to study at the University College of London for their master's degree in records and archives. And they started the cataloging project, but this was never conclusively ended due to institutional inertia and also the lack of will and drive. It was a great opportunity for these records to be catalogued so that we know which type of archives were taken abroad, so that when we make claims, at least we've got evidence to this effect. And then construct this now to the efforts that were done in Kenya by Professor Nathan Munjama and Kamis with the Zanzibar records. And then at the International Council on Archives in 2023 conference in the United Arab Emirates, Desplat provided a list of former Commonwealth countries that had records in custody at the National Archives of the United Kingdom, and that these had been digitized. And the list included countries like Cameroon, Eswatini, Gambia, the Republic of Nigeria, Sierra Leone, and Botswana. And she proceeded to quantify the volume of these records, but what was conspicuously absent was the files on Zimbabwe. And upon further inquiry, she reported that the plan is to continue with the files relating to African countries, and that those relating to Zimbabwe will be processed in due course. The National Archives UK is also helping with the provision of the digitized copies to facilitate access to shared memory. And such digital records repatriation is what Ngwepe and Dikotla in 2025 advocated as they urge UK archivists to assist Commonwealth members in this regard. And this takes us to the issue of ethics and tension. The issue of preservation raises infrastructural challenges that has been a challenge for most developing countries. And so keeping these archives in Western repositories has helped with storage, so the argument goes. So infrastructural challenges, the lack of the development of archival services, and security issues are some of the reasons highlighted. The joke goes that African countries, they forgot their archives in the euphoria of independence. It should be noted that in most developing countries, European colonial powers were responsible for the creation of administrative archives that in turn formed the basis for national archives once independence was achieved. And this modeling has been a recipe for disaster in terms of representing post-colonial societies with limited infrastructural support from their respective governments. And what this means is that the European way of archiving, adopted at the dawn of independence, is not fit for purpose. And so there is need for an Africanized archive. For example, here in South Africa, the National Archives and Record Service of South Africa is severely under-resourced and faced with a number of challenges that is actually compromising its ability to sustain an archival service. And these infrastructural challenges also extend to other archival institutions within the East and Southern Africa, and this has been documented in the literature. And this archival underdevelopment has been used as justification for the safekeeping and retention of these African archives in Europe. And so the question arises as to whose record are we preserving and which knowledge do we value? And the required standards often reflect Western colonial and institutional priorities that privilege state records over community memory. And so, why does this matter now? This is where the issue of decolonization comes in. They need to refigure the archive. In The Wretched of the Earth, Frantz Fanon urges Africa to be innovative and be pioneers in our efforts to take humanity forward. In other words, we need to be masters of our own destiny. From this perspective, decolonization means making a new start and developing a new way of thinking. So we need to rethink what we consider to be a record. We need to rethink about this. In our textbooks, in our scholarship, you find that the orthodox or canonical definition of what a record is problematic. We're talking of evidence that has been received. We're talking of records that have been preserved because of the evidence contained in there. But then this needs to be extended to the indigenous ways of knowing. We need to talk about inclusivity. So the definition of what a record is needs to be reconsidered. And then secondly, just check the language in which these archives are written in. This is where the issue of archival lexicography comes in. And this needs to be expedited. And this is part of advocacy and archival activism. And then thirdly, the issue of digitization. It raises issues of access and ownership. As we digitize, are we not prolonging the dispossession of these archives? This is where the shared heritage concept becomes problematic. Because digitization, it actually highlights symmetries of power in terms of funding, infrastructure, technical expertise, and standards. The global north will assert their dominance on these mentioned issues. And also, for the record, digital copies or surrogates can never be a substitute for the originals. Hence, the authenticity issues, they are brought to the fore. And one other interesting aspect, which I do share with, is for us to look at what Africa Agenda 2063 talks about. One of the 7 aspirations of Africa Agenda 2063 is Africa with a strong cultural identity, common heritage, values, and ethics. Because archives are key expressions of cultural memory, heritage, and identity, the agenda's emphasis on heritage means that having archival materials of African origin being accessible and correctly located is aligned with that aspiration. So we should be talking about decolonizing archives, and rightly so. In his foreword to the disputed archival heritage book, Bastian notes as follows: as former colonial entities increasingly look towards decolonization, is it time to discard those colonial records in favor of building dynamic archives of the now? One that values both the culture and the cultural heritage of the formerly colonized, rather than continuing to value records produced by the oppressor. So archival activism should focus on refiguring the archive for it to reflect what the community needs. Our archives should be talking to the community. One of Africa's brightest legal minds, Professor Paul Lumumba, in 2025, correctly remarked that when you decolonize, you must have a culture founded on our value systems. And some others, they further note that we need to shut the door on this imperialist narrative that privileges the colonial perspectives. And such views, they actually resonate with the 2063 Africa agenda, because we need to repurpose, we need to refigure our archives so that they speak to our people to promote accessibility and use. It would be remiss for me not to mention or to talk about the Algiers Declaration. Towards the end of 2020-25, there was an international conference on the crimes of colonialism in Africa, which was held in Algeria. And this conference produced the Algiers Declaration, which is a continental reference text for criminalizing colonialism and developing an African strategy for reparations and restitution. With the adoption of this Algiers Declaration, the African Union has moved from moral grievance to a structured legal offensive. And this declaration, it outlines a framework that includes 4 critical pillars of accountability, but I'll just highlight 2 in the interest of time. And also these 2, they actually speak to the thesis of this lecture. So among these 4, the third one talks about the unconditional restitution of Africa's cultural and tangible heritage, ensuring that stolen history is returned to its rightful soil. And then the fourth one, The declaration calls for continental economic audit to calculate the staggering cost of centuries of resource plunder. This is where the issue of reparations comes in. To conclude, these are some of the issues that we need to consider as we embark on our conversation or on our discussion. What does justice look for migrated archives? Should we consider compensation or ownership or both? And then secondly, who should shape archival features? Is it the state, the government, or is it society? Or it should be a joint enterprise? Or it should be individuals who are inclined to archival activism? And then thirdly, can archival activism transform institutions, or it must exist outside them? And also, how do we reconcile archival activism with a code of ethics for record-keeping professionals? And then finally, how do we conceptually frame archival activism in migrated archives? Do we need a record-keeping model that is rooted in activist practices? I thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Garaba. Over to you, Krystal.
Thank you so much, Dr. Garaba. I really appreciate all of the connections that you were able to make today, highlighting what you have made seem very obvious, this progression towards archival activism being so perfectly in line with working with migrated or disputed or displaced archives. Especially for me working here in Canada, I see a lot of connections with your work. I work in repatriation currently, and I see a lot of people talking about this idea that digitization will help to solve a lot of the issues that we have with, Canadian institutional archives holding Indigenous records. So I particularly appreciate you explaining how that actually highlights asymmetries in power. And that is something that I would like to take with me in my work. I am wondering, you ended on the idea of a record-keeping model rooted in archival activism. And I think you talked a little bit about that throughout, or a lot about that throughout this presentation, but I wonder if you could highlight a few sort of key components that a record-keeping model rooted in archival activism would look like.
Thank you so much. Yes, that's a good point, which I do share with. We must be mindful of the fact that the records are political. And as one engages with the scholarship, you find that there are two models that have been used to explain the concept of migrated archives. The records continental model has been used by Vivian Fritz Esami. She applied the continental model to digital record keeping and governance. And then also have Narisa Timbari. She applied the continental thinking to indigenous knowledge and community archives. And then also have Michael Carabinos, who applied the continental thinking to the Foreign and Commonwealth Office and Migrated Archives. And also I applied this content I'm thinking to liberation struggle archives, in which I advocated for a continuum of care in terms of their stewardship. And then there's also the affect theory, which is propagated by scholars like Sarah Ahmed and Brian Masumi. And they highlight the fact that archives, they are not just collections of information. They also carry feelings. You talk of power, you talk of lived experiences that shape how people react to them. So the affect theory, it highlights that records, they are not neutral. So when you talk about these migrated archives, you talk of issues of loss. Those communities are actually separated from their records. So we need more empirical research as to how communities have been affected by this loss. And then secondly, the issue of trauma, especially in colonial and conflict contexts. Because some of these records, they actually document human rights abuses. And then the third issue pertains to pride or identity. When our culture is being preserved elsewhere, these records are being preserved elsewhere, there is this sense of disconnection. There is this sense of injustice. So this is what I've been trying to highlight there. But again, this is subject to interrogation because for these graduate students or scholars, it's something for them to take forward with so that they engage with some of these theories, with some of these models, or even better still, propose or come up with some of models that actually conceptually frame this concept of migrated archives and archival activism. That's the point that I was trying to get at.
Thank you, Dr. Garaba. We have a very welcome and excellent intervention from the chair of the expert group on shared archival heritage at the International Council on Archives. Welcome, welcome. Dr. Garaba, that was an excellent presentation. As chair of EGSAH, I'm fully aligned with your perspective. I would be very interested to hear how you perceive the phenomenon of migrated archives in Portuguese-speaking countries. Additionally, I have published a chapter in English addressing the issue of digital fungibility in the context of displaced archives, often used as a justification for non-repatriation. I would also like to emphasize that EGSAH is open to participation from all and is, for the time being, the only platform where these topics can gain meaningful visibility. Thank you very much for that welcome in your note and for joining us today. Always lovely to have fellow ICAers in these chats. Over to you, Dr. Garaba. Do you want to address any or?
Thanks, Dr. Jamila. With regard to your works on migrated archives in Portuguese countries, if you could share your works with me, I would really appreciate. But suffice to say that these migrated archives, as I pointed out, it all depends in the context in which these were created, and then also the need for them to be brought to home, so to say. So this actually drums home the point of archival activism. And also when you look also at issues of compensation and so on, I don't know how this is panning out in Portuguese speaking countries. So I would definitely want to engage with your works in this regard. And then also for the invitation to join the expert group on migrated archives, yeah, that would be great indeed. And thanks for that.
Thank you, Dr. Garaba, and thank you for the follow-up note as well. I hope we can be in touch. That's exactly what these events are for, a chance for us to connect around shared interests and advocacy. Dr. Garaba, sadly, we're coming to a close, but I would like to just very quickly add my own thank you, not only for the very, very generous things you said about my work, but also for bringing, for that expression of solidarity for Palestine and Lebanon that you took time to share through your presentation. As it turns out, apparently there's quite a few people from Lebanon today. So I think that was very, very touching for us all. I want to just really highlight how much I was struck by the notion of care as control. I think that's an excellent way to kind of capture the paternalism and kind of continued racialism behind the claim that we can't return archives to their places of origin because of capacity and the need to preserve them, and there isn't the right kind of facilities. As I highlighted in introducing you, Dr. Garaba, your work really moves us beyond some of these key impasses that have developed in this migrated, displaced archives debate. And I think that is an example of that. At the same time, care that doesn't look like control looks like helping figure out how to address those capacity issues so that repatriation and return is possible. Another thing I wanted to amplify is I heard some really important and very important calls to action in your presentation, again, in terms of moving out beyond this impasse. And one of them is thinking about how can we think about archival lexicography, which I think is a very important thing you've put on our agenda that I just hadn't even thought about before. So thank you for that. Another thing is to think about digitization, both as a global initiative, something maybe that takes a bit more thinking, but also it made me realize that, you know, even in that context, where is the conversation to determine what digital return really means? So again, another call there for conversation and thinking and reaching back in terms of people reaching towards us. I also heard a call, which is certainly, I think, been part of this course here, archival activism, to think of what that means in the context of the Netherlands, of Amsterdam, of the Dutch. And certainly we've been exploring and thinking about Dutch Empire from Indonesia to Suriname, and we will continue doing that, and really want to acknowledge how important that is for us to take on here. And I wanted to also thank you for thinking so seriously about the theme of this course in your presentation. I really appreciate that. It's very helpful. It accords and elaborates and enriches our own conversations about what is archival activism, and do you do it in or out or both, or what's possible? And my last thing that I want to say is that this issue you're raising of authenticity, wow, you've really hit the nail on the head. And when you raise that issue in terms of the limits of digitality, as part and parcel of that, we are coming back to the question of the evidence of the crimes of colonialism, which you've really brought in and is no doubt the big elephant in the room often in these conversations. But you've also brought our attention back to this question of the fact that there is no trust, and that building that trust is itself part of working towards a solution. I have no doubt that Africa will realize these struggles for repatriation of the archives, but also for reparations, and also for healing and moving beyond all these colonial legacies. So thank you so much for your work, making that possible, Dr. Garaba, because our liberation is all tied in together. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone for joining us. Thank you, Crystal and Dr. Karim and Rose Mayenga's in the room for your work in this. Dr. Garaba, any closing remarks before we shut down this Zoom room?
Thank you so much, organizers, for this opportunity to share with your students and also fellow participants in the record-keeping fraternity my views on Migrated archives. I hope my ideas have actually aroused interest among these graduate students so that we build a corpus of literature on Migrated archives. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.